Hello, I'm Lee Hatcher from Hammond Care Public Affairs in conversation with Professor John Swinton, Professor in Practical Theology and Pastoral Care in the School of Divinity, History and Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. John is also working with Hammond Care on spirituality and spiritual practice relating to older people, particularly those living with dementia. John, thanks so much for joining us again.
Pleasure.
In the second of our conversations, I'd like to explore your role with Hammond Care and what it means to be a Christian organisation. What difference do you say that might make in the care of people?
Well, that's the question I think that we're going to be working on over the next few months together. What difference does it make? Because in a sense, if the care, the structures, the way in which Hammond Care encounters people doesn't make any difference in terms of Christianity, then you may as well take that out of your mission statement. And the question of what it means is complicated, because clearly it doesn't mean that you're proselytizing. It doesn't mean that you have to speak about Jesus every time you have a conversation in your staff meetings. But it does mean that you have to have a general ethos that suggests that you're doing something differently. A general ethos that suggests that the gospel in all of its fullness and its understanding of what a human being is, who God is, what it means to be a creature, actually impacts the way in which you see the structures of your organisation from the top right down to the bottom. Because one of the things in relation to spiritual care is that if management and the general shape of the system militate against spirituality, even if, for example, that you don't have time to do these things, then spiritual care becomes something that's a problem for the system. Because sometimes we think there's pastoral care here, down at this level, and it's me being nice to you. I can only be nice to you, A, if I've been trained to see you properly and to recognise who you are, and B, if I've got time to do it. Because in the kind of research we do, many people say things like, spirituality is really important. To take time to search for meaning, and it's what makes you human, but we haven't got time to do it. Now, if you haven't got time to do the very thing that makes you human in a system, then there's a problem. And it's not necessarily your problem on the ground, it's the way that the system is structured. So I think that a minimum Hammond Care as a Christian organisation needs to ensure that the structures from management, administration, right down to pastoral care militate for good care and militate for good human relationships.
What about the place of a Christian organisation in an increasingly secular society, and where faith is much more about spirituality and other religions than Christianity?
Well, one of the kind of weird and ironic things about the conversation around secularization and spirituality is that people are so keen to have this big, broad definition of spirituality that sometimes they won't include religion. And so you've got to say, we must include everybody apart from you. Right. And so I don't think that there's any tension whatsoever, because the only way in which we can understand and engage with spirituality is in a spirit of hospitality. And a spirit of hospitality means that your belief I take seriously. I respect your integrity, and you respect my integrity. We can then have a conversation, and in that conversation we can probably become friends. And if we can become friends, then a lot of these barriers come down. So I think the key for Hammond Care in terms of spiritual care is to be Christian, and to be as Christian as they can be. Because as soon as you start trying not to be what you are, then you're in trouble.
I'm sure I know the answer to this question, but does a Christian organisation equal a perfect organisation?
No. No more than a Christian represents a perfect human being. If we're going to take the idea of sin seriously, then we're not going to suddenly see that the churches or Christians are exempt from being fallen, sinful creatures. We may be struggling, and we may see things that other people don't do as we move towards redemption, but no.
But what about when it does struggle and fall?
Right.
What do we make of that? You say you're a Christian organisation.
People fail. If you look, why else would Paul have written the letters? The only reason he wrote them is because people were failing, and that's in one sense that's the beauty of the Christian tradition, is that you strive to do your best you can for God, but you fall, then God picks you up. You strive to do your best, and you fall, but in the end, things move in the right direction, because ultimately it's not up to you and me to fix things. That's God's job. The job you and I have is to do what we're told. And the job of Hammond Care is to do what it's told.
What about those for whom a Christian organisation cares who have no Christian faith?
Well, in John's Gospel, John talks about that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. God so loved the world. You know, when you look at the ministry of Jesus, he hung around with tax collectors and sinners, right? Not reformed tax collectors and sinners. And he clearly wasn't lecturing them all the time, otherwise he wouldn't be accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. In other words, he was able to be with a broad range of people without losing his integrity. And I think that's the key for Hammond Care. You can be a Christian organisation, but your love extends to all human beings because God so loves the world.
How would you distinguish between Christian faith and spirituality?
Well, I would distinguish kind of contemporary understandings of spirituality from any religion in this way. The broader definitions of spirituality as a search for meaning and purpose and hope and value and sometimes God are basically modes of self-actualization. It's I want meaning, I want hope, I want purpose, and if I make a choice, then I can go and have something transcendent or divine. So it fits in quite nicely with an individualized culture where you have a desire to be happy, and happiness is the goal. Whereas within most religious traditions, your spirituality comes from outside yourself. It's a gift that's given to you by God. So within the Christian tradition, the whole of your life as a creature is given to you by God. And then your spirituality is how you work out that relationship, that givenness in your day-to-day life. And that's a very different way of looking at things, because it means you're dependent, you're contingent, you're vulnerable, you're part of a community, and you simply don't make decisions for yourself. And sometimes decisions are simply made on your behalf. That doesn't sit very well with an individualized culture, but the broader understanding of spirituality does. So there's a contextual, cultural dimension to that, the difference between these two things.
How will the different approaches shape up when it comes to the issue of suffering?
It's more complicated with suffering, really, because the advantage that a religious tradition has, or the Christian tradition has, is that not that it explains suffering, but that it tells different stories about suffering. And it enables us, for example, simply not to be lonely in our suffering. You know, the whole idea that God suffers with us, the whole idea that God is with us in the midst of our troubles, is profoundly important, because if you have a different story that drives your spirituality, where you're just alone, or where you're simply drawn on the expertise of strangers in a healthcare setting, that's a very different way of approaching the world. Now, the Bible doesn't, in my opinion, explain suffering. Quite the opposite. It tells us there will be suffering. So I never quite understand the criticism about how can God allow this, in the sense that the Bible never said it wasn't going to be that way. It's not like there's a contradiction. But what it does do is it gives us the narratives, the practices, ways of looking at the world that help us to suffer with hope, and sometimes to be healed in the midst of that.
If a person says to you, I have no faith, is that possible in your view, for someone to not believe in anything?
It's possible for somebody not to have what they would call a formal set of beliefs, but everybody believes in something. If you're a scientist, you believe in the philosophy of empiricism, that the only form of truth that you can see is that which you can see falls upon the retina of the eye. So we all have our philosophical or theological perspectives. It's just a matter of which way, when we choose, or how we choose to assess the validity of what we believe. So I think we're all constantly believing in lots of different things.
Should everyone who works for a Christian organisation be Christian?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think for an organisation like Hammond Care, or my own denomination, the Church of Scotland, which is a major aged care provider, there's an ethos that can be shared that's not necessarily for you to take on board the whole thing. So I think you can have people who work for a Christian organisation, as long as they're happy to sit within that ethos, that can function very, very well and can be conduits for God's love, even though they don't necessarily recognise that.
Can we wrap up our conversation with something practical? Can you relate to us an instance where good spiritual care within the Christian framework has really made a difference to someone in care?
I can tell you a strange story that slightly dissonant. One of my colleagues, who's a minister in Aberdeen, or was, who's quite liberal in the way that he understands the gospel, was preaching a sermon on suffering. And the essence of the sermon was, God created the world good, the world fell, but eventually he'll fix it, so you don't need to worry too much about suffering. So he took 45 minutes to say that. I prefer my shortened version of it.
I'm with you.
Exactly. And then, but after the service, two sisters came up to him. And one of them was dying of breast cancer. And both of them were very angry with this guy for the sermon that he'd preached. Now, he thought he was preaching that healing, peaceful, helpful sermon. But for them, it was actually very important that God had done this, that God was engaged with us, because if God had done this, then there was purpose to it, there was meaning to it, there was value in the midst of it, and there was the hope of life after this horrible experience that we're going through. His view kind of took that away from him. And so that's an example of how you can read and misread a situation of suffering. So within the midst of that situation, even though you might say it was an unusual theological view, it actually was functioning really healthily, or relatively healthily. Whereas you might say the other one, which was a very healing view, actually was functioning pathologically in their lives. So it's how you learn to read the experience of illness that is a beginning point for good spiritual care.
Professor John Swinton, always great to chat. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
You're welcome.